this again. So, we start with the common finch. It's coming from South America. It starts with 0.7 and 0.3 P and Q of one allele, okay? When it travels to the Galapagos Islands, based upon either the birds that get there, which would be the founder effect, if we're talking about only a few from the major population, and I would think that the founder effect is definitely something I would think, okay, is occurring. We can also think of the same mechanism, the bottleneck effect, if a lot of them, let's say, flew, okay, if they were migrating, got caught in a storm, and only a few, what, got there. So whether it's the founder effect or the bottleneck, it doesn't matter. The idea is that in both of those mechanisms, the frequency of the birds that get there is different than the frequency that's in the major population. Now, in these two effects, whether it's founder or bottleneck, okay, the bottom line is, because we're dealing with a low population, and now the frequency of the recessive allele is now 70%, what are the chances of the next generation having more recessive alleles for this one allele? Much greater. And what could happen is that really quickly you could have the next generation have 0.9 just by chance and then 0.1. And what does that mean? The next generation, there's a 90% of getting the recessive allele. It's kind of like having you start out with a coin that you can flip, and it's 50% heads and 50% tails. And all of a sudden they give you a trick trick coin, I can speak, right? And that one does not flip. It's weighted on a certain way that most of the time it comes up heads, okay? So now, even though you can be P or Q still, the chance of actually making or getting a gamete lucky enough to survive and be fertilized to bring on more of the dominant alleles is certainly decreased. Now you're dealing with a flip coin that's now a trick coin, and almost certainly this is going to go into the next generation where possibly that P is now 0 and the Q is 1. And you've lost a dominant working allele. And that allele, of course, could be an allele that's due to reproduction. It could be slight, but that reproduction means that no longer can these birds in 3 generations fly back and mate with these birds. Okay? And so that's an example of how we can have speciation. Now, in truth, it's not just one allele. This is happening with all their alleles. And so sometimes that could lead to death. Not all things speciate. Most things that are living in terms of speciation, okay, even though I'm not showing this, okay, don't make it, okay? And that's why you see these what? Where are these common ancestors? Okay? Where are these common ancestors? They're not there, okay, for good reason, all right? However, that's one way to think about this. Now, so that's what we talk about genetic drift. Natural selection is easy to talk about because once they got here and they drifted away in terms of allele frequencies, and hopefully not too much, then they had different selective pressures based upon, hey, were there big nuts to eat on the ground? Where there is cactus to eat? Like, why would you eat a cactus? Well, then that's all they have to eat on that island they got trapped on. So those that had the what? Longer beaks to get into the cactus survived, had what? Reproductive fitness better than others. So beak size is a nice what? Morphological structure we look at, and it's a homologous structure. These are homologous structures. Their beak side, okay, happened by divergent evolution, okay? Any case. Now, so we've done natural selection. Of course, we understand how that occurs. The ones with the bigger beaks that lived on the island that had more of a cactus-growing vegetation were able to survive better, okay, because they had that allele. And if they didn't, they would go extinct, okay?
Husky?
Yes?
I have a question.
Sure.
If they were all on like similar islands, then why are they all different colors?
There are in a very similar geographic region, but what's really cool about the Galapagos group of islands, and there's a bunch of them, is that they did not have very similar types of environmental conditions. The environmental conditions were very, very different among those islands. That's why researchers still today love to go out there. Okay, so you've got islands that were very tropical, that could support big, big seeds. You also had ones that were very arid and dry and had cactuses that were so very different. So the reason why there's so much speciation here is because there was so much natural selection. Only the alleles on the low frequency, okay, that best suited these conditions were able to reproduce, and that led to the different beak sizes. So that's to answer your question. It sounds like they should all be on the Hawaiian Islands, should all be the same. It's not the same here. These Galapagos islands had very, very, very different, okay, environmental conditions, and that is why there's so much speciation here. So we know clearly, just by what we name them, large cactus groundfinch, they eat on the ground. Vegetarian finch, large tree finch. These names, mangrove finch, these are telling you exactly what they're really good at doing. What they had to be good at doing, and if they weren't good at doing this, they would have what?
Died out.
They would have gone extinct. Okay? They had to adapt in their what? Next generations in terms of natural selection. Now there's one little piece we haven't talked about, gene flow. Because if birds can get here once, then you bet your donkey that they would get here what? Twice, 3 times, 4 times. So you got to believe there's a constant supply of these birds. Now they're not going to do what? Look at all the different crazy amount of speciation that occurred here. These guys look a lot like what? The warblers, don't they? So maybe these guys, and it hasn't been studied, but the warblers here that look a lot like the mainland finch, they have kept their original what? Alleles, because there's constant supply of genes from the mainland. So there's a group of finches that do look very similar, but look at this. Look at the common ancestor. These guys are far different from these guys. So this little clade right here, we believe is due to the constant supply of gene flow from the mainland that keeps bringing birds. And it's not going to be easy and quick for these guys to become that. It's easy for these guys to evolve here. Okay? This is a gene flow. And maybe some of these can produce hybrids long enough. And maybe there's, some birds here that can mate, okay, and not quite speciated. So there's a constant flow of organisms, and we think creates this more older evolutionary clade, but one that's far different from these guys, okay? All right, so that kind of brings it, I think, in somewhat all together. Evolution is changing the allele frequencies. I keep showing you just one, but a lot of times it's many, meaning that could be beak size, it could be reproductive, or it's post or pre-zygotic. It could be feathers. It could be how they call to each other, the sound, the throat size. All of these alleles are changing through genetic drift, through speciation. Remember, speciation occurs because there is a what? Reduced genetic variability, okay, as we go toward a certain type of food. We talk about what? We talk about natural selection. What kind of natural selection is this? We used to have a bell curve, but now the selection is pretty narrow. What's that? Stabilizing. So these are all stabilizing. And as they stabilize, what are they doing to their alleles here? Getting rid of them. They're not a chance to survive. So their variability drops as they speciate, as they become different reproductive barriers, which means they're what? More susceptible for extinction in natural selection. So natural selection, yes, helps bring on selected alleles, but it could lead to a decreased variability genetic-wise, and it could expose them, okay? And of course, gene flow could limit certain good alleles for the island. If this keeps bringing in older alleles that are not best suited for the island, these birds may not be very good in terms of reproductive fitness. And of course, when you go from a population to a smaller population, whether it's the founder or bottleneck, you're always starting with a small amount of population. And so therefore, you can't help but have that genetic drift where you're moving allele frequencies just by chance. Okay, all three do contribute for a limitation of genetic variability. Okay, all right, so let's continue on where we left off. So I can continue on here, all right, and fly through some of this. So if I want to go to my evolution slide, I think I want to start, I'm going to forward it to genetic drift. We talked about all of this. And now I want to go here. All right, so I know I touched on this last week, but I want to make sure we hit on it. Because we have mechanisms, gene flow, natural selection, especially stabilizing selection, okay, and genetic drift, all can produce decreased genetic variability. There has to be a mechanism where we maintain some of that. We can't go from a very simple cell organism to us today. And us today looks something like this, right? Okay, there you go. We can't go to that individual. All right? All right. Yes. Okay. If those that can't see that, we can't go from a single cell to this. Okay? Okay, we can't go from a single cell.
That's like Homer Simpson.
It does.
Okay?
Your screen's off because you disconnected.
Doesn't it?
It does.
What disconnected?
I think he said the
Zoom, you
screen.
disconnected from the
Yeah,
Zoom.
I don't really know what happened, but Connor was hosting it.
Okay, well, don't host, Connor.
Come on.
Can you still hear me? Can you still see me?
No, we can't see you.
Okay.
You either.
Okay, you can hear me. Okay, hold on to your ponies for a second.
That's a very good Homer Simpson.
Yeah.
I mean, the first one you look at is like
It's amazing where you can see evolution popping up.
flat elders,
Yeah.
flat-faced elders.
Okay, so if someone took over the host on purpose, then you stop my screen share. And if you stop my screen share because you did something on purpose, then you're stopping what I'm doing right here. So stop screwing around if you're doing that. Okay?
You disconnected, and when you reconnect, it doesn't.
I never reconnected. Okay?
Wait, if
How
he
about
disconnected,
now?
then how's he still on there?
We can see it.
Okay. All right, so if someone, listen, I'm not saying you did or didn't. It could happen. Who knows? Let's continue on. All right, let's go. So, yes. So a single cell organism goes to us not because we limit our variability. We've increased it over time. Okay, so there has to be mechanisms that balance this off. Okay? All right, so the major one is something called Heterozygote Advantage. As I showed you in this island, we could have gone from 0.7 to 0.3 to 0.1 to 0.9. Okay? Unless there are some type of mechanisms that maintain the diversity as we speciate. And heterozygote advantage is certainly one of those mechanisms. There's a couple of them, but this is one you have to know. A heterozygote advantage means there's got to be an advantage of not quite being a homozygous recessive or homozygous dominant. Having the hidden, okay, in this case being T little t. We talked about being a taster. There has to be some kind of heterozygous advantage in being able to taste, let's say, a little bit of the bitter flavor. Maybe you can say, okay, I taste a little bit of bitter flavor. Oh, I know it's a poison. But because I only taste a little bit of the bitter flavor, I can still eat things that are bitter and therefore still get the what? Nutrients. I've got the best of both worlds. Now, if you're a heterozygous taster, and it works that way, I don't know if it does, but if you're a heterozygote and you are selected for being able to do what? To discern between things that are poisons and to be able to eat food that is bitter and good for us, you're going to have a greater fitness. And you're going to keep maintaining both alleles. And therefore we maintain our what? We maintain our diversity. Okay, there are plenty of them that help with that. Now the greatest example is sickle cell anemia, which is one single mutation for hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein. And there's an example of what this looks like. As I said to you last week, sickle cells can get caught and trapped in our single cell-wide passages called capillaries. And if they get trapped and they can block up, they can cause a blockage. And a blockage of blood flow can be deadly, okay? Especially if it's in your head, it could be a stroke, or in your heart, or a heart attack, or an embolism. Cutting off blood flow is deadly, okay? Now, interesting enough, there's a heterozygote advantage of being a heterozygote in terms of sickle cell. Let's call sickle cell anemia big S and little s. Having the big S means that you carry the broken allele to produce, having the little s means you carry the broken allele. That means that you don't make the hemoglobin in the right shape. And if you're homozygous recessive, that means you can't make any of these. All of your blood cell is like this. And that usually is certain death, okay? Unless you have blood thinners and there's different ways to combat that, okay? And you would think, by nature, if you have S and little s, if you're homozygous recessive for sickle cell anemia, without modern medicine, why do we still have it today? You would think that that would have gotten rid of that allele as these individuals would have died. Okay, well, interesting enough, there's a heterozygote advantage. Being a heterozygote means you have enough chromosomes that are good to produce the proper shaped red blood cell that gets and can bend in and get into our blood cells and travel without being blocked. You still make some of these, but you have enough of these to survive. Why is it an advantage? Well, there is a parasite that travels on a mosquito that is very apparent in the African area here that gives you something called malaria. And people died by the thousands of malaria, except for the people with sickle cell anemia. Or you could definitely die being little s and little s because you don't make the what? The correct red blood cell that it blocks. So you're definitely selected for death there if you don't have modern medicine. But if you're a heterozygote, what maintains the little s in the population so you don't lose it is that these people die less often from an even bigger event, which is malaria. So distribution of malaria caused by the parasite. Okay, you can see that malaria in this region, okay, is selecting for individuals to be a heterozygote, to have not so much a lethal amount of the red blood cell, but just have enough of the what? Recessive amount, so that it gives you resistance and you survive. So here's an example of how heterozygotes, okay, that instead of just losing all of the little s's, which you think would be good, actually there is an advantage to have or be the carrier. Okay, that's important. And it happens in many, many areas, in more areas than we think. And again, we always talk about one allele, but there's many of them. So this is one example where we maintain the diversity, and this doesn't run away and take off all of the recessive alleles. And you may say, well, I don't see how that's an advantage. Well, maybe, what if that mutation that caused a broken allele could have led, instead of sickle cell, leads to a brand new allele, a bigger brain, a bigger skull to hold a bigger brain. So many different things that this protein that had a mutation now can do. Remember, it's the code in your DNA that codes for amino acids, that codes for the proteins. The proteins catalyze the reactions. So a mutation. So how do you think we got here? There's mutations in other things that caused what? Brand new alleles that were what? Beneficial. There's also alleles that are made that are not so beneficial, and we could possibly die. So maintaining the mutation in our population by heterozygote what? Advantage gives us an opportunity to move forward in evolution and grab new alleles, so you guys can do what? Draw the cladogram where you're doing, hey, there's the new one. This is A, B, C, D. Hey, there's a new allele. We keep adding new alleles here, okay, in that divergent method. That's what maintains them, because if you start losing them all the time, we never get to where we are. All right, it's important to understand a heterozygote advantage. Okay, there's also something called gene duplication. Okay, ice fish can survive in temperatures that should freeze the fish. But because of a gene duplication, it created a new allele, okay, that created antifreeze kind of like running through their veins. So they didn't freeze, okay? And therefore they were able to live in areas that other fish didn't live, which means they can go grab what? More resources. That's important in terms of punctuated equilibrium, as we'll get there. Okay, sexual selection. This is an example of natural selection. We say sexual selection, don't forget, it's a form of natural selection. So it's a natural selection for mating success. We did one thing with the group at home. We talked about who was pretty and who was ugly, okay? And I know some people wanted to go to the, guidance office? Patricia? All right? But who was the ugly and who was the pretty, okay? But sexual selection is a real form of natural selection. And so females, in terms of the peacock, tremendously attracted to the plume of feathers that the male has. I always thought it was weird growing up that why does the male have the feathers, right? And listen, stereotypes are stereotypes, but my dad was to call it like a man's man, you know? If he ever caught me with these feathers like this, he'd be very mad at me, but it's okay if you wear feathers. I'm just saying, I thought it was kind of strange. And now thinking about it, and you start getting educated, it made sense. The female is attracted by sexual selection, pretty, okay, male, because for him to have these robust amount of feathers and to be bright would mean that what? That male peacock is very healthy because it's able to hunt, grab the food, and produce this bright colored plume of feathers. To produce those colored feathers, it has to have the right nutrition. Yes, you have to have the alleles and the mutations that cause them, but you also have to have the resources from your environment to produce them. Those that can't produce that this big plumage of feathers, don't have the nutrition or the genetics that they're healthy. Okay, so the plume of feathers attracts the mate to say, hey, that's a healthy individual. Now, they're not thinking that, okay, but over thousands and thousands of years, these birds only picked the ones that were the healthiest, and the other males that looked different, guess what? They didn't have any fitness. So over time, all the males look like this. How about in lions? Why do we have this thick mane for the male? Well, the females pick the strongest males. They don't think, hey, he's sexy, okay? But the mane makes them look bigger, stronger, okay, more athletic, more of a producer for the household. And again, the males that don't get a chance to mate, they don't have the fitness. So the females have picked those parts of the population, those males, that indirectly or directly has worked to their advantage because they have picked the most healthiest of the males. And it makes sense. If they pick males that are not healthy, they're going to have offspring that aren't, and of course, that risks the next generation. So that big mane makes them look bigger, okay? And, you know, you think of the questions, did humans have some of that? Okay, so you can talk about the bright plumage of males and females, and that is all due to sexual selection, a form of natural selection. If they can produce those bright colors and have that mating, a visual, they must be more healthy. Now, they didn't think that way, but it did work to their advantage, because in order to have that plumage, you had to be eating right. You had to be able to hunt better, okay? And now you think about natural selection, and I don't want people to start running around thinking organisms get better. As long as we can do what? Maintain our diversity through natural selection, we get better. No. Evolution, even in natural selection, is just a what? Compromise. There is no perfect organisms, correct? So what might be a good thing might also be a bad thing. So the bright plumage that these males or females, I guess it might be males in the case, I'm not sure, but I know the peacock has the bright plumage and some are flipped, but what makes them great for sexual selection also makes them easier for predators to get them. But it still must mean that the sexual selection has a greater advantage of having more what? Potent offspring than the increase of the prey getting them, correct? Because they're still here. And all it has to be is a slight 0.00. There has to be a slight advantage in these populations doing it this way to pick the best mates, to produce the best zygotes for the next generation, even though that they risk being eaten more by their predators. There must be just still a better advantage that way. That's all you need. If reproductive success due to the attraction of the plumage outweighs the risk of predation, then this trait will be selected for. And it just has to just beat it. Okay? One hypothesis why female preferences evolve for certain male characteristics is that certain males have good genes. Okay. Are we affected by the same evolutionary mechanism? Yes, we are. What catches our eye in terms of what we think is physically attractive as a population, not as an individual, has come from this sexual selection. Okay? More often than not, if you see a man in a magazine with his shirt off, okay, he's not malnourished. Okay? He doesn't have brown teeth. Okay? So, the people who put people in magazines do so because it catches people's eyes. How do they know? They run test groups. They do. Marketers do research, they do science, and they know what catches people's eyes. People have put the science of what good looking is. Now, I know, in my opinion, good looking is always depth of the skin as well. To me, personality outweighs physical characteristics. But in terms of population, what people think are good looking, okay, is an actual science that marketers use. And we're affected by that because of millions of years of us selecting our mates in much the same way. Know that we don't have the feathers. Hey, look at that feather. Okay, there may be other things that people select for. Okay, so that's something that's within us as well. And we know this is true because we look at certain organisms like frogs that have a longer mating call, produced offspring that outperform offspring that had shorter mating calls. So the female picks frogs based upon how well your mating call is. Okay, and the findings are the ones that have a better mating call maybe do so because they've got better muscles to produce the call a little longer, because they have better nutrition, because they're stronger, and all of the above. They just got better genes. Okay, there's something to it. So why natural selection cannot fashion perfect organisms? This is really important. Selection can act only on existing variations. Remember, selective pressure means what? You have a new geographic condition, whether you're a founder, whether you're a bottleneck, or whether the condition changed where you are. You only evolve if you have that allele in low frequency that now best suits that population, correct? Okay, well, what if you've got an allele that works but it's not great? You survive, but you're not great. That's what happens most of the time. Now, if it's not good enough, you go extinct, but you may have something that works, okay, just by chance. So evolution is limited by historical constraints. Adaptations are often compromises. You may have something that works, but it also makes you susceptible to something else. Just like having, bright feathers helps in sexual selection. It may tip the scales in terms of predators eating you. Okay, so here are some examples of some organisms that have evolved that are definitely not perfect organisms. The blobfish and the purplefish. Okay, these guys are not champions. They're going to be on any cover magazine, but they had alleles enough to survive just 0.001% of the time, and they did so. They didn't have the perfect alleles, but there they are. And there's many examples.
I've never seen the purple fish before.
Yeah. We saw the monkey. I think the purple fish is actually an underground frog. I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm not all right. But here, okay, some really interesting. Someone gave me some mole rats. James and Amanda gave me mole rats. That's just, that is an example of evolution just being cruel. Hey, you can survive. But man, I don't know. All right, maybe you should not have.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay. Now, of course, speciation, origin of new species. Okay, how do we define it? We define it by becoming reproductive isolated. Okay, and that isolation occurs due to a couple different methods. Hybrids are the offspring between different species. Sometimes they survive, sometimes they don't. So don't think that two species can't always reproduce. Now, it's important. Reproductive isolation can be classified whether they occur, these factors, before or after. So real fast, I know you've been through this, but we have prezygote. What's a zygote? Zygote is a,
Fertilized egg.
right, which means it's an egg with what kind of number of chromosomes? The diploid or the haploid?
The diploid.
The diploid. Good. It's fertilized. Mother and dad came together. So this is before it gets fertilized. They're in different habitats. Snakes in the water, snakes on land. They probably could reproduce, but because they have evolved to live in different areas with different food, okay, they don't ever are in contact. Temporal. Well, we've got different organisms that mate and fertilize in different time periods. So they may be able to mate, but because their reproductive cycles are different from each other, okay, doesn't work. Behavioral isolation. Over time, you can have different behaviors, meaning the males and females don't get, there's a new feather that appeared it doesn't like, a new sound. And of course, mechanical isolation. Okay, the parts don't fit. And the gametic isolation, okay, the gametes can't get close to each other. And of course, there's the post-zygotic areas. Okay, we'll pick that up tomorrow. All right, we're getting there. Have a great day.